Welcome to Better Than Before. This series is a collaboration with CANARI, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, with funding from the Open Society Foundations. We are exploring how to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting the Caribbean's transition to socially inclusive, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable development. I am your host, Durval Bazi, founder of the Climate Conscious podcast. Today's special guest has worked as an educator, trainer, facilitator, advocate, and researcher in the field of gender and development in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Her main areas of work have included training in gender-based violence, gender issues in climate change and disaster risk management and resilience, poverty, globalization, the media, and gender responsive policy. She is a gender and human rights practitioner, defending women's human rights against all forms of discrimination in the context of intersectionality of gender, race, social class, sexual identity, and disability. She is further guided by her understanding that gender responsive policies take into account the gender needs, rights, responsibilities, and experiences of women alongside those of men. Her work includes promoting women in leadership positions, designing training modules on transformational leadership for both men and women, and lecturing at UW Mona campus in the undergraduate program for gender, climate change, and disaster risk management. In 2014, she received the Order of Distinction for invaluable contribution as a gender development specialist in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Thanks for joining me on the podcast, Judith Wedderburn.
Thank you so much, Derval. I really am honored and, of course, pleased to be able to contribute to the work of CANARI by participating in this podcast. And I want to thank CANARI for giving me this opportunity and also thank the team of people I know are involved in this project. Thank you so much. So here I am.
Today we're discussing COVID-19 recovery and gender equality, social inclusion, and addressing structural inequalities here in the Caribbean. The COVID-19 pandemic brought on tremendous pressures and significant socioeconomic disruption. So the existing inequalities were amplified. Now, as governments pump resources into recovering from the effects of the pandemic, which included unemployment, decline in GDP growth, and increased national debt, it is acknowledged that COVID-19 is interconnected to all the other challenges. Now, in every crisis, there is opportunity. Post-COVID recovery efforts present the opportunity for us to rethink development in the Caribbean and integrate sustainability, resilience, and justice. So firstly, Judith, I'd love to hear from you. What does sustainable development in the Caribbean mean to you?
Thank you, Derval. So just a quick reminder that our Caribbean comprises countries described as small island developing states or SIDS, with a history of enslavement and colonization and high levels of poverty. They are currently highly indebted with their most critical resources at risk from severe climate change impacts. So for me, sustainable development has to cover a number of areas which are integral to our own life experience. Literature recognizes at least 4 pillars that undergird sustainable development. And these are human development, social development, economic, and environmental, which are interrelated. And if they work the way I think they should work, they would enjoy high levels of complementarity in the way in which each pillar develops in order to achieve the sustainable development. Importantly, we know that the UN identifies gender equality as Sustainable Development Goal number 5. And the first one is poverty, removal, reduction of poverty. So this is a clear indication that development itself is undermined by inequality between women and men and will continue to be undermined as long as this goal is not achieved.
Yes, and I love that we're getting straight into it. Because as you know, CANARI supports efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals throughout the region. And as you mentioned, one of the goals, Goal 5, is gender equality, which is about empowering all women and men. So can you share with us how gender, social inclusion, and development, how are these all connected?
Sure. So understanding gender and its significance in Jamaican and Caribbean society in general is critical for effective policy and strategy making, research, and advocacy on the road to sustainability. For me, using a gender lens, a gender responsive approach focuses on how traditionally women have been marginalized from development initiatives in relationship to men. This means that our research and gender analysis enables us to better understand the gender needs of women, especially given their additional care, health, household responsibilities, the burden of which is often not acknowledged, made invisible, and therefore not addressed fulsomely. Understanding gender also explores the gender needs of men, whose gender responsibilities are traditionally the same for decades, but some changes we're seeing are taking place. But men are not normally expected to take on the care, household health responsibilities expected of women. The connection fully recognizes that groups of men are similarly left out because of class, ethnicity, or education skills. And so a gender responsive approach would take men's gender needs, like those of women, into account. So one other thing, with respect to social inclusion, our lives as women and men are shaped by what I've written elsewhere as a gendering process. So we are socialized by an understanding of what it means to be woman and what it means to be man. In this sense, a traditional process of social inclusion takes place. However, it is a process of socialization in which gender inequality between women and men is pervasive, and in which gender relations are often complex and sometimes contradictory. This, therefore, invites us to analyze how gender is constructed through relations of power between women and men, to understand how women are historically more constrained by unequal power relations, and better understand how they can be enabled and how to respond when shifts in power relations take place. So finally, with sustainable development, as I suggested above, as our goal, I identified 4 pillars. The development process then addresses gender inequality in all spheres of life, as experienced by vulnerable groups, which include many, many women, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and members of the LGBTI community.
So you mentioned the 4 pillars of sustainable development: human, social, economic, and environmental. But even within that, it's important that we acknowledge that when we're addressing those issues, it's not gender neutral. It's important to take into account the lived experience of both women and men and examine the prevailing processes of socialization. And you mentioned in your opening statement about our history of enslavement and colonization and I guess systemic inequalities that we have been working to address, but definitely there's a lot of work still to be done.
Thank you for that, though, because you're right. The inequalities, all forms, social inequalities, including gender inequalities, are systemic and often manifest in critical institutions because that's how they were crafted from the beginning, given our colonial history. And some of that is still with us, alive and well, unfortunately.
Yes. So, can you share briefly a bit about your work in gender, social inclusion, and development in the Caribbean?
Okay, so I'm guided by a gender responsive approach. So, one example is the work that I have done with the household workers in Jamaica through a series of over several years, training, educational workshops with members island wide to improve their own understanding of the ILO conventions which govern the workplace, yes, in which the conventions address the rights and the responsibilities of both employer and employees. And these rights include the right to decent work. We know what that means in ILO terms. Rights under Jamaican labor laws, especially sexual harassment at the workplace, which is problematic sometimes because the household worker's workplace is the employer's home. Many factors need to be taken into account in that space, including workshops with employers themselves. Then there is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which highlights very clearly what the rights of workers in all workplaces are entitled to and is of particular significance for workers in an employer's home. What my program did was supported, in addition to the training about labor laws and the ILO conventions, our ultimate objective was to support their advocacy campaigns locally, regionally, and globally, so that eventually they do become their best advocate. And in Jamaica, we've had sterling examples of how that has happened, which has allowed them to establish their recognized place in the social inclusion process, which is going on around us all the time. More regionally, I led a team, including different Caribbean activists, sometimes from Barbados, sometimes from Trinidad, in capacity building workshops in collaboration with some women's groups, like, for example, CAFRA, which I believe, like many women's organizations, especially regionally, is no longer functional. But in the time in which CAFRA functioned, CAFRA was a force to be reckoned with. And I was very proud that we could partner with groups like CAFRA and other networks in the region and interact with women in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, Grenada, Dominica, specifically to deal with the prevention and reduction of gender-based violence, strengthening women's leadership rights at community and local levels, helping to build their skills at national levels so that they could enter the conversation, shape the conversation in their own national space, shaping the social inclusion process in their countries, have a voice in that process as they sought to address the gender gaps, which are present in those Caribbean territories as well, and how to respond when shifts in power relations take place. And also, we supported the women to contribute to regional and global interventions and advocacy on all of those subjects.
I must take this opportunity to thank you for your service over the past 30 years in terms of closing the gap when it comes to gender inequality in the region.
Well, Derval, there's certain things that just have to be done. Also, in my early years of advocacy, the women with whom I had the honor of working with, mostly feminists like myself, you get to the stage where you realize if you do not do it yourself, it will not get done. Yeah? Which meant that we often had to do volunteer work, because if you think funding for this kind of work is less available now, you should have checked us 25 years ago. But having said that, the work had to be done, and therefore we persevered because the work is not complete, as you well know, as you've said so beautifully.
Yes, indeed, the work is not complete. So, Judith, how did the COVID-19 impact gender issues and social inclusion in the Caribbean?
In Jamaica, there's an institution called CAPRI, which thankfully does a lot of this work, so we can use it. And there was a piece called The Impact of the Pandemic on Domestic Violence and Community Violence. So I'm going to refer to some of the really troublesome findings in this way. Pervasive problem of so-called transactional sex between girls and older men in Jamaica is confirmed. It is often called consensual sex between girls aged 12 to 15, sometimes even younger, which cannot be described as consensual. As a child under 16 under Jamaican law who has sex, it is seen as forced sex. You know, from a legal point of view, agree? Yeah, I mean, that's debate. People challenge it, but we know what is being said.
Yeah.
And this would have been with older men up into their 60s. The research reaffirmed that in these situations, girls are paid very little. And we find men portraying it as if they are helping the family by giving money to the girl in exchange for sex because he feels sorry for her. It is well documented that taxi men offer support to carry a child to school. They get the confidence of the mother who doesn't have the money to send the child to school. Then he, after a couple of days of kind and caring service, the taxi driver demands sex from the girl one day on the way home from school. Related now, poverty is a big factor. The research shows something we knew before, but it was made even more evident in COVID-19, that girls might engage in transactional sex because they're hungry or their family has needs, and they use the money they get to help feed their brothers and sisters and even help send them to school, which is really sad. Some, though, do it for personal gains because they want a high-end phone or they want the latest bling clothes, you know? And the COVID-19 pandemic made things worse because the loss of regular income, offices closed, you couldn't go to work, especially little corner shops, which in poor communities were vital spaces for low-income families to go and buy food as they needed it every day. Some people from the families worked in those shops, so they experienced loss of regular income, which forced many people to look for alternative sources of money. And this is related now to a noticeable increase in the acceptance of the transactional sex arrangements. Now, this is a long-term problem, highlighting the ways in which poverty and the real needs of young girls is exploited. You're exploiting the poverty status and you're exploiting their real needs. The girl becomes an income-generating asset for the family. She's almost a commodity. Some families turn a blind eye to this sexual exploitation. Some even encourage it. And other research tells us sometimes the mother encourages it because she went through a similar time in her adolescent years. And she will say to her daughter, I know nothing, it's just a little sex. You understand Jamaican dialect?
Yes.
Okay. So the wider community often then sees nothing really wrong with this situation. However, we do have documented that there are other families that fiercely protect their girls from this abuse. And then they earn the wrath sometimes of the wider community, but they protect their girls. Couple last points now. And this is more directed towards children and education. The impact of the pandemic has made the situation worse because access to some previous safeguards against violence, abuse, or sexual violence has been lost. What do I mean? The schools closed to stop the spread of COVID-19. This meant that girls no longer had guidance counselors to talk to at school. It was no longer possible for teachers to observe if something is wrong with the child's behavior, and this new behavior should be investigated, maybe to get protection for the child. And can I just say that also emerging is that this takes into account some of the violence that boys also experienced in this time. So this coincided, the report says, with an increase of sexual abuse of girls by their stepfathers or other family members. because people living in poverty are cooped up in very small spaces. So I guess in a way they turn on each other. It sounds horrible to say it, especially if the mother goes out to hustle. She needs the money. And the male partner, who may or may not be the child's father, is left alone with the daughter. Or the teenage girl is on the street hustling herself when she would otherwise have been in school, which does provide elements of protection and care from guidance counselors. Reports are now emerging more recently about the mental problems facing children of all age, unable to go to school to get counseling. In many poor communities, there was either no or very little connectivity so that children could log on to the teaching that the Ministry of Education advertised would be happening. So at home, these children would be observing the increase in domestic violence, with large families in small spaces forced to stay inside. We are seeing more research about the long-term impacts of all of this on the emotional well-being of children.
Well, thank you for sharing those sobering insights
Yeah.
about the reality of the impact of COVID-19 that is often missed by the mainstream. So, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the goal has become to build back better. So, essentially, all the investments that are being made in boosting the economy, they also need to take into account gender equality, which we touched on, but also the social well-being of our people in the Caribbean. So, in light of your experience, how can we leverage the COVID-19 recovery initiatives to really enhance inclusion, equity, and justice of citizens?
Just to remind our listeners that most Caribbean SIDS are highly indebted, which constrains their capacity to adequately respond to the now emerging reports of the many ways in which COVID-19 has affected citizens' lives and their livelihoods. To address them requires resources, financial, additional budgetary provisions, human resources to do this, and of course, the technology. But I don't think we have an option other than to build back better in a way that enhances the social inclusion, the inclusion, equity, and justice for citizens generally. And in these areas, the inclusion, equity, and justice are areas in our societies where the playing field was not level, right? And what COVID-19 did almost, clinically was to expose the gaps in each of those areas. So to build back better, we have to better understand those gaps in equity, gaps in inclusion, gaps in administration of justice in order to build back better. Yeah. So how can the region leverage the COVID-19 recovery initiatives, right? So we had COVID-19 in Jamaica anyway. I remember the date, March 13, 2020 was the first whole-scale lockdown. I mean, it was a serious lockdown of one of the most impoverished communities very near to where I live. It was like, something very unusual and harsh emerging before your very eyes. But most Caribbean acids also experience severe climate impacts like hurricanes in the last couple of years before COVID. So when COVID hit us, we were all in recovery from some severe climate impact. Some islands were more hardly hit than others, especially in the areas of loss and damage, not only for women and their families, but in relation to critical economic sectors, the agricultural sector on which we are very dependent, tourism, earn our foreign exchange, manufacturing, education, damage to schools and hospitals and clinics, damage to infrastructure, roads and bridges. This is what, quote unquote, recovery from severe climate impacts would look like. while at the same time continuing to pay down the debt, which we all owe, without laying off public sector workers, teachers, nurses, doctors, and police, who themselves have been affected and who are critical to health recovery. So it is quite a conundrum and a leverage as a region now. So I honestly believe at this stage that each Caribbean SIDS goes to the UN or the IMF or the World Bank as an individual country. We are so, on a scale of 1 to whatever, the size of our economy, the size of our population, we are so small. I think we need to just remind ourselves that we do have power if we somehow are able to speak together, because we face the same challenges. So, leverage as a region, the work done by Prime Minister Motley, as an example, to get climate disaster financing for Caribbean SIDS. Each country has to be prepared to do the research. From what my reading tells me, it took Barbados about 2 years to better understand our country's debt. Who owns it? How can elements of it be reorganized to release critically needed funds, perhaps restructure debt payments, to provide the fiscal space for these funds to be available to undertake the programs and initiatives to build back better? I really think that each small Caribbean SIDS, I'm not saying we don't have strength and resilience in many ways, but in the global financial world, it seems to me that when we come together and are able to speak with a one voice somewhere, we stand a better chance of making a significant difference to our future. My thoughts are that each of us will be particularly challenged to take this on alone. So I'm suggesting some kind of sharing of information, learning from each other, sharing insights, while working towards a particular way of organizing one's own debt. That's one possibility for a regional leverage some resources available.
I mean, I definitely agree with you that we are stronger together and we will reach further together as a region, and especially given, similar histories and makeup. So I want to ask you, Judith, how can we really utilize a gender-sensitive approach to building back better? And in particular, how can we better support women and underserved groups in our efforts to build back better?
Most importantly, we have to do the research that clarifies, exposes very clearly the gender needs of women and their families, and how those needs, if not addressed, will just ensure that we don't build back better. We have to know where we're coming from in order to improve on that situation. I do believe that not enough attention is paid to doing that research through a gender lens in a very granular way, understand the gendered lives and livelihoods of women and their families. It's beginning to happen in some places, but I think we should make it a basic commitment to any work we do going forward if we're really interested in building back better. If you don't understand where you're coming from, you don't understand the gaps that existed before COVID, if we don't understand the size of those gaps, if we don't understand the size of the wage gap between women and men in our countries, if we don't understand how much more vulnerable women are to gender-based violence, what do we need to do then to reduce their vulnerability? Because that has to be part of building back better, so that women can live a life free from the fear of violence. So in a way, Derval, everything is connected to everything. I think we just need to commit to doing the research using a gender lens. Whichever sector we choose to work on, whether it's in the economy, or it's environment, or it is justice, there are gender inequalities and inequities. And it's only if you put on a gender lens and work granular down to see how people are living their lives, will we better understand that situation, and then we know how to build back better. And can I just add, build back better, not just to survive, but build back better to grow as a resilient family, to grow as a resilient woman, to grow as a resilient agricultural sector, whichever area we choose to work on. Can I just share a little anecdote? You thank me for working these 30 years. I had to remind somebody the other day that when those of us were really concerned about violence against women and how women's bodies were objectified in many kinds of ways, such that the woman's body was just to be exploited, you know? And we remember very clearly the days when a woman would go to the police station to report it. And what do you think she was told? Do you have that experience in Trinidad, Derval? What was she told 30 years ago?
Yeah, I think we have a similar reports in terms of them sending them away without really
go back home and fix it.
Yeah.
So that most of those incidences were just not reported. So the size and the danger of the violence that women were facing because they were women was not recorded, it wasn't made public, it wasn't better understood. But I know we work together, both in Jamaica and across the region, to help women understand what they had to lose if we didn't get together and ensure that those incidents of rape or domestic violence are reported. And gradually over time, the number of reported cases increased to the extent now where it is a pandemic in and of itself. And by the way, the police still talk about reported cases because they know that many of the cases are still not reported for various reasons. They get threatened, they feel bad, they want to forgive the man. The church says to them, go home and you're yoked, go home and work it out. Family don't want to be embarrassed. So a lot of that's a culture of silence they get trapped in, and that still exists. But there is now more support for women who understand that they have a right to not be abused or violated, and they have a right to be able to speak their truth about the violence that they face. So over time, the cases do get reported. So that's how far we're coming from. And I believe, similarly, to build back better, we have to do the research using a gender lens to demonstrate just how bad the situation is, whether it's poverty, mental health of women and girls and boys, yes, gender gaps in pay, whatever. To me, if we don't use a gender lens, what are we going to unearth? What are we going to reveal? How do we ensure that we're going to build back better? It must be better than something, better than what existed before. So we have to really understand what existed before.
As we wrap up this discussion, I would love to hear from you in terms of what is one recommendation you would like to see implemented in the region that would improve inclusion, equity, and justice as we seek economic development?
The pandemic exposed for all to see and admit to the huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Our citizens, women included, were not able to access such resources that do exist, were not able to cope with the pandemic, the extent of the poverty associated with the lack of access to proper health, care, services, food and nutrition, and violence in household and communities. So the one recommendation I would like to see, Derval, is that the consistent and intentional use of the gender lens to unearth with data that can be used to demonstrate how not having gender equality, how not having improved inclusion, social inclusion, how not having gender equity, gender and social equity, and justice as critical pillars of the sustainable development, including economic development in the region.
Thank you for highlighting the importance of, as you said, the fulsome consideration of gender issues and the importance of consistent and intentional use of gender lens. Like sustainability, like climate resilience, gender and inclusion has to be integrated in all systems in our society. And we definitely have to continue doing the work of dismantling those systems that exist, the systems that we have inherited that do not support or contribute to greater equality, inclusion, and justice.
These discussions, especially when I get an opportunity to engage with the younger generation, I just love intergenerational work. I appreciate it. So I am most grateful to yourself, Durval. Because the truth is, you have to continue the work, dear.
Yeah.
So you better open as many of your kind who come from your, understand the challenges and are willing to do the work. You better rope in as many as possible.
Thank you so much for listening to the Better Than Before series. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. For more info, or if you'd like to share your questions and ideas directly with us, please connect with CANARI and the Climate Conscious Podcast on any of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my personal favorite, LinkedIn. See show notes for direct links to our websites. The Better Than Before series is a production of the Climate Conscious Podcast in collaboration with CANARI, funded by the Open Society Foundations. This series is edited and produced by Bradford Media, with artwork by Carrie Lee Dixon. Join us on the next episode.